December 1944, when German POW Hans Müller was captured during the Battle of the Bulge, he expected the brutal treatment his own army gave to prisoners. Instead, American guards handed him hot coffee, a sandwich, and processed him with clipboard efficiency that stunned him more than any interrogation could. What he discovered next about American abundance would completely shatter everything the Nazi regime had taught him about his enemy's supposed weakness. But how could a nation fighting a global war on multiple fronts still have enough resources to treat their prisoners better than Germany treated its own soldiers?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. December 1944 brought the coldest winter Germany had seen in years. Snow fell thick across the Ardennes forest, covering the frozen ground where Obergefreiter Hans Müller crouched behind a fallen oak tree. His breath came out in white puffs as he clutched his Kar 98K rifle with fingers so numb he could barely feel the trigger. The 24-year-old logistics officer from Bavaria had not eaten a proper meal in 3 days. His stomach growled constantly, a hollow ache that had become as familiar as the weight of his steel helmet. Hans had grown up believing in German efficiency. His father worked in a Munich factory that made precision instruments. Every gear fit perfectly, every measurement was exact. The Nazi Party promised this same precision would win the war. They said German engineering was the best in the world. They said their enemies were weak and soft, especially the Americans who cared more about jazz music and Hollywood movies than fighting. For months, Hans had managed supply lines for his Wehrmacht unit. He knew exactly how many bullets they had, how much fuel remained in their tanks, and how many days their food would last. The numbers always came up short. Trucks broke down because they had no spare parts. Soldiers wore paper bandages because they had no cloth. Winter coats never arrived because the trains that carried them got bombed. Hans learned to make one potato feed 3 men and stretch a can of meat across an entire squad. The propaganda officers still visited their positions, telling the men that Germany was winning. They said German soldiers were cowards who would run at the first sign of real fighting. They claimed American equipment was cheap junk that would fall apart in battle. Hans wanted to believe these words, but his supply reports told a different story. Every week, his unit received fewer bullets and less food, while American bombing raids grew stronger and more frequent. On this frozen morning in the Ardennes, Hans watched through his binoculars as American tanks rolled through the forest. The Sherman tanks moved in perfect formation, their engines running smoothly despite the bitter cold. Behind them came trucks loaded with supplies, their tires gripping the icy roads without slipping. Hans counted at least 50 vehicles in the convoy, more than his entire division had seen in months.
The attack came faster than Hans expected. American artillery shells screamed overhead, exploding in the trees around his position. Machine gun fire crackled through the forest. Hans fired his rifle twice before it jammed from the cold. He tried to clear the bolt, but ice had frozen the mechanism solid. Around him, other German soldiers threw down their weapons and raised their hands. Some were boys barely 18 years old. Others were old men who should have been home with their grandchildren. Hans had heard terrible stories about what happened to German prisoners. The SS officers told them that Americans tortured captives and left them to die in the snow. They said Soviet soldiers were even worse, shooting prisoners on sight. Hans expected the worst as American soldiers surrounded his position with their rifles pointed at his chest. The first surprise came immediately. Instead of rough treatment or angry shouting, a young American sergeant approached with his weapon lowered. The sergeant spoke broken German with a smile on his face. He asked if Hans was hurt and offered him a drink from his canteen. The water was clean and cold, better than anything Hans had tasted in weeks. Another American soldier, barely older than Hans himself, gave him a cigarette and helped light it with a silver Zippo lighter. Within minutes, more American soldiers arrived with clipboards and forms. They moved with a calm efficiency that reminded Hans of his father's factory. Each prisoner received a number written on a small card. American medics checked everyone for wounds, applying real bandages made of white cloth instead of the paper strips Hans was used to seeing. One medic gave Hans 2 aspirin tablets for his headache and marked something on a medical chart. The processing happened so quickly that Hans barely had time to understand what was occurring. American MPs moved through the group of prisoners, writing down names and unit information. They worked faster than any German clerk Hans had ever seen, yet they never seemed rushed or panicked. One MP spoke perfect German and asked Hans about his hometown in Bavaria. When Hans mentioned Munich, the American smiled and said his grandfather had visited there before the war. The biggest shock came when the Americans brought hot coffee in large metal containers. Real coffee, not the bitter acorn substitute German soldiers had been drinking for months. The liquid warmed Hans from the inside out, and he realized his hands had stopped shaking from the cold. Along with the coffee came thick sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper. Hans bit into bread that was soft and fresh, filled with more meat than he had seen in a single meal since 1943. As Hans sat in the back of an American truck, wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled clean and new, he watched the efficient machine of American logistics at work. Supply trucks moved in endless lines along the forest roads. Soldiers unloaded boxes of ammunition, medical supplies, and food with mechanical precision. Radio operators coordinated movements with calm voices and clear instructions. Everything worked exactly as planned, like the gears in his father's factory, but on a scale Hans had never imagined possible.
The truck's heater kept the prisoners warm as they drove toward an unknown destination. Hans stared out the window at American supply depots that seemed to stretch for miles. Mountains of equipment sat covered by canvas tarps, fuel trucks lined up in perfect rows. Hans had spent months scrounging for single bullets, while these Americans had entire warehouses full of weapons and supplies. Something fundamental had shifted in Hans's understanding of the war that we could not yet put his thoughts into words. The propaganda had been wrong about American weakness, but if they were this strong and organized, what else had been lies? The train ride to the prisoner of war camp took 3 days, but these were unlike any 3 days Hans had ever experienced during wartime. The heated passenger cars maintained a steady temperature of 70 degrees, warmer than most German homes in winter. Hans pressed his face against the clean windows and watched the American countryside roll past. Farms stretched to the horizon with red barns that looked freshly painted. Cattle stood fat and healthy in snow-covered fields. Small towns appeared every few miles, their main streets lined with automobiles that gleamed in the winter sunlight. Every few hours, American guards distributed food that seemed to come from an endless supply. Ham sandwiches thick with real meat arrived wrapped in clean paper. Apples that were crisp and sweet, nothing like the withered fruit German civilians fought over in bombed cities. Hot soup came in metal containers that kept it steaming for hours. Hans counted the meals and realized the Americans were feeding him better as a prisoner than his own army had fed him as a soldier. The other German prisoners whispered among themselves in amazement. Otto, a tank commander from Berlin, had not seen white bread in 2 years. Franz, an artillery officer from Hamburg, held a chocolate bar in his hands like it was made of gold. The Americans had given each prisoner a small care package containing cigarettes, soap, and candy. Hans examined the soap carefully. It was perfectly white and smelled like flowers, not the gray chunks of lye that German factories produced when they had materials to make soap at all. When the train stopped in Chicago, Hans saw through the windows a sight that challenged everything he thought he knew about America during wartime.
The train station bustled with thousands of people, all dressed in clean clothes and carrying leather suitcases. Women wore lipstick and nylon stockings. Children ran around eating ice cream cones in December. Men in expensive coats smoked cigars and read thick newspapers. This was supposed to be a nation at war, yet these people looked like they were going on vacation. American Red Cross volunteers boarded the train at every major stop, carrying boxes of supplies for the prisoners. These volunteers were mostly older women who spoke softly and smiled genuinely. One grandmother from Iowa gave Hans a knitted scarf and asked about his family back in Germany. She listened with real concern when he mentioned that he had not heard from his parents in months. Another volunteer, a former school teacher, brought German language books and magazines. Hans opened a copy of Life magazine and saw photographs of American factories producing tanks, planes, and ships at speeds that seemed impossible.
The numbers in the magazine articles stunned Hans more than anything he had witnessed so far. American factories built one airplane every 4 minutes. Shipyards launched a new cargo vessel every day. Steel mills produced more metal in a month than Germany made in a year. These were not propaganda claims, but actual photographs showing assembly lines that stretched beyond the camera's view. Workers in clean uniforms operated machines that moved with mechanical precision. Hans had managed supply lines long enough to understand what these numbers meant. America was not just winning the war through superior strategy. They were winning through sheer abundance. The prison camp in Kansas appeared on the horizon like a small city built in the middle of endless farmland. Camp Concordia stretched across hundreds of acres, surrounded by a single fence topped with wire. Guard towers stood at the corners, but Hans noticed the guards seemed relaxed rather than threatening. American flags flew from several poles, snapping in the cold prairie wind. The camp's main gate was wide enough for trucks to pass through easily, and Hans could see supply vehicles moving in and out constantly. Inside the camp, Hans discovered living conditions that surpassed anything he had experienced during his entire military service. The wooden barracks were newly constructed with real glass windows and electric lights in every room. Each building had indoor plumbing with hot and cold running water. Central heating kept the temperature comfortable even when the outside air dropped below zero. Hans's bunk came with 2 wool blankets, a pillow with a clean white case, and sheets that smelled like they had been washed with good soap. The mess hall operated like a machine designed by engineers who understood both efficiency and human dignity. 3 times each day, American cooks served meals to over 2,000 prisoners without confusion or delay. Hans joined the line for his first dinner and watched steam rising from large metal containers filled with food. The serving portions were measured precisely, but the measurements were generous rather than rationed. Hans received a piece of roast beef larger than his fist, mashed potatoes covered with real butter, green beans that were still crisp, and a slice of apple pie with a golden crust. Hans ate slowly, savoring each bite while trying to understand what he was experiencing. The meat was tender and flavorful, seasoned with spices he had almost forgotten existed. The potatoes were smooth and creamy, made with real milk instead of water. The vegetables tasted fresh, as if they had been recently picked from a garden. The pie was sweet and rich, filled with apples that must have been stored in perfect conditions since harvest. Hans walked around the camp and discovered more evidence of American abundance. The camp store sold cigarettes, candy, soap, and writing materials at prices prisoners could afford with the wages they earned from work details. The library contained thousands of books in German, including technical manuals and novels that had been banned in Germany. The hospital was equipped with modern medical equipment and supplies that never seemed to short run. American doctors treated German prisoners with the same care they would give their own soldiers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Late that evening, lying on his comfortable bunk with his stomach full for the first time in months, Hans stared at the electric light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The bulb burned steadily without flickering, powered by generators that never seemed to fail. Outside his window, he could see trucks arriving with tomorrow's supplies, their headlights cutting through the darkness. The American war machine never stopped, never ran short, never broke down. Hans began to realize that his country had not just underestimated American military strength, they had completely misunderstood the nature of American society itself. Thanksgiving morning in November 1944 arrived cold and clear across the Kansas prairie. Hans woke to the sound of American cooks preparing something special in the mess hall kitchens. The smell of roasting meat drifted across the camp, rich and savory in a way that made his mouth water before he was fully awake. Other prisoners stirred in their bunks, drawn by the same incredible aroma that seemed too good to be real. The camp commander, Colonel Peterson, announced over the loudspeaker that today would be different. American tradition demanded a feast of Thanksgiving, he explained in careful German, and prisoners would share this meal as guests rather than captives. Hans had heard about American holidays from the propaganda officers, who claimed these celebrations proved American weakness and self-indulgence. Soldiers who stopped fighting to eat turkey, they said, could never defeat the disciplined German war machine. When the mess hall doors opened at noon, Hans could not believe what he saw inside. Long tables covered with white cloth stretched across the entire room. Each table held platters of food that belonged in a rich man's mansion rather than a prison camp. Golden brown turkeys sat carved and ready to serve, their skin crackling and steam rising from the tender meat inside. Mountains of mashed potatoes topped with butter created small valleys filled with dark gravy. Sweet potatoes glazed with brown sugar caught the light from overhead lamps. Green bean casseroles bubbled in metal pans large enough to feed a company of soldiers. Hans took his place in line behind Otto, the tank commander who had not stopped talking about the abundance since their arrival. The American serving staff, both soldiers and civilian volunteers, wore clean white aprons and smiled as they loaded each prisoner's plate with portions that would have fed a German family for a week. Hans watched his plate fill with slices of turkey breast, spoonfuls of stuffing, rich with herbs and butter, cranberry sauce that gleamed like red jewels, and vegetables cooked to perfection. The volunteer serving Hans was a middle-aged woman from the nearby town of Concordia. She spoke broken German with a Kansas accent, asking if he wanted more gravy and piling extra rolls on his plate without waiting for an answer. Her kindness felt genuine, not forced or performed for show. When Hans thanked her in English, she smiled and said her own grandfather had come from Germany many years ago. She hoped Hans would find comfort in this meal so far from home.
Hans carried his overflowing plate to a table and sat down carefully, afraid to spill even a drop of the precious food. Around him, 2,000 German prisoners fell silent as they began to eat. The only sounds were the quiet clinking of forks and knives against metal plates, and the occasional satisfied sigh from men tasting flavors they had almost forgotten existed. The turkey was moist and seasoned with herbs that Hans could not identify. The stuffing contained pieces of sausage and dried fruit that burst with sweetness on his tongue. Even the vegetables, which Hans had learned to hate in army rations, tasted fresh and carefully prepared. As he ate, Hans found his mind wandering to memories of home that seemed like they belonged to another lifetime. His mother's kitchen in Munich during peacetime, when she could still buy real butter and white flour. Sunday dinners with his father and younger sister, sharing a chicken that had to stretch across 4 plates. Christmas mornings, when his family exchanged small gifts and ate cookies made with real sugar. Those meals had been celebrations of scarcity, overcome through careful planning and saving. This American feast, was something entirely different. It was an abundance shared without effort or sacrifice. The revelation hit Hans like a physical blow to his chest. He set down his fork and stared at the half-eaten food on his plate. The Americans were not feeding their prisoners this way because they were weak or soft. They were doing it because they could afford to do it without thinking twice. While German families rationed single eggs across a week, American prison camps served meals that would be considered luxury in the best restaurants of Berlin. While German soldiers fought over scraps of bread, American captors gave their enemies more food than those enemies had ever seen in their own army. Hans began to understand that everything he had been told about this war was backwards. The Nazi officers had called Americans weak because they cared about comfort and luxury. They said German strength came from accepting hardship and sacrifice. But what if abundance was actually a sign of strength rather than weakness? What if a nation that could feed its enemies better than Germany fed its own soldiers was not soft, but impossibly powerful? That evening, alone in his bunk, with a stomach fuller than it had been in years, Hans wrote in the small diary he had started keeping. His pencil moved slowly across the page as he struggled to put his thoughts into words that made sense. He wrote about the turkey dinner and the kindness of the volunteer servers. He wrote about the waste he had seen. American soldiers throwing away food that German civilians would fight over. He wrote about the endless supply trucks and the electric lights that never went out and the hot water that flowed whenever anyone turned a handle. Then Hans wrote the words that would change everything he believed about the war and his place in it. Americans did not need to starve their prisoners because they had no reason to fear scarcity. They did not need to be cruel because they were strong enough to choose mercy. Germany had taught its soldiers that suffering built character and that hardship created strength. But what if real strength meant having so much that you could share it with your enemies? What if the ability to be generous was the truest measure of power?
Hans closed seine diary und lay back on his pillow, staring at the ceiling in the darkness. Outside his window, he could hear the rumble of American supply trucks bringing tomorrow's abundance. The sound no longer seemed like enemy activity. It sounded like the heartbeat of a machine so vast and capable that it could afford to be kind. Hans had not just been captured by American soldiers, he had been captured by an idea that challenged everything he thought he knew about strength, power, and what it meant to win a war. The ship that carried Hans back to Germany in April 1946 moved slowly through the grey waters of the North Atlantic. He stood at the rail with hundreds of other former prisoners, watching the coastline of Europe appear through the morning fog. The American Liberty ship had fed them well during the crossing, serving meals that were still better than anything most Germans would eat when they reached home. Hans carried a small canvas bag containing his few possessions from the camp. Inside were 3 chocolate bars he had saved, a can of American peaches, and a small notebook filled with his thoughts about what he had learned during his captivity. The contrast hit Hans before the ship even reached the dock in Hamburg. The city that had once been Germany's proudest port lay in ruins that stretched beyond the horizon. Entire blocks had been reduced to piles of rubble where weeds grew through broken concrete. The few buildings still standing showed gaping holes where bombs had torn away walls and roofs. Skeletal frames of burnt-out warehouses pointed toward the sky, like the ribs of dead animals. The harbor itself was clogged with the twisted metal remains of ships that had been sunk during the final months of the war. German officials processed the returning prisoners in a warehouse that had no heat
and barely enough electric power to light the registration tables. The clerks wore thin coats and moved slowly, their faces showing the hollow look of people who had not eaten enough for too long. Hans waited in line for 6 hours to receive papers that would allow him to travel to Munich. The official who stamped his documents was a man about his father's age, whose hands shook from hunger or cold or both. When Hans offered him one of his chocolate bars, the man's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. The train journey south took 3 days because the tracks had been bombed so many times that locomotives could only move slowly around the damaged sections. Hans shared a car with 40 other passengers, packed together on wooden benches in a space meant for 20 people. There was no heat, no food service, and the windows had been replaced with boards after the glass was blown out. The passengers sat in silence mostly, wrapped in thin blankets and staring at the devastated landscape rolling past outside.
Every town and city Hans saw from the train window told the same story of destruction and desperate survival. Factory smokestacks stood broken and cold. Bridges had been rebuilt with rough wood instead of steel. Farm fields lay unplanted because there was no fuel for tractors and no fertilizer to feed the soil. People walked along the roads carrying bundles of possessions, moving from one ruined place to another in search of work or family or simply a place to sleep. Children played in bomb craters filled with rainwater, their clothes patched and too small for their growing bodies. Munich appeared worse than Hamburg because Hans remembered how it had looked before the war. The beautiful churches and government buildings that had defined the city skyline were now broken shells. His family's neighborhood had been hit by incendiary bombs that burned entire blocks to ash and twisted metal. Hans walked the last 2 miles to his parents' house, stepping carefully around rubble and unexploded ordnance that still littered the streets more than a year after the fighting ended. His mother answered the door after he knocked 3 times, moving slowly as if she expected bad news from any unexpected visitor. When she recognized his face, she collapsed against the doorframe and wept tears that seemed to come from months of held-back grief. She had lost 30 pounds during the war and looked 20 years older than when he had left for the army. His father appeared from the kitchen, walking with a cane because shrapnel from a bombing raid had damaged his left leg. The small apartment felt cold and empty, furnished only with pieces they had salvaged from neighbors who had not survived. That evening, Hans shared his saved American food with his parents around their kitchen table. He opened the can of peaches with careful ceremony, dividing the sweet fruit into 3 equal portions. His mother ate slowly, closing her eyes to savor each bite of something she had not tasted in years. His father held a piece of American chocolate on his tongue until it melted completely, unwilling to let the richness disappear too quickly. As they ate, Hans told them about the prison camp and the abundance he had witnessed there. His parents listened in amazement as Hans described the Thanksgiving dinner and the heated barracks and the endless supply trucks. They had trouble believing that American prisoners ate better than German officers, that hot water flowed whenever you wanted it, that electric lights burned all night without rationing. His mother asked if the Americans had been kind to him, and Hans struggled to explain kindness that came not from weakness, but from having so much that generosity cost nothing. Over the following months, Hans found work helping to rebuild the city's transportation system. His experience managing military supplies made him valuable to the reconstruction effort, and he quickly understood that Germany would need to learn from American efficiency if it ever hoped to recover from the devastation. He studied the organizational methods he had observed at Camp Concordia, applying American principles of logistics and planning to the enormous task of rebuilding a shattered nation.
Hans married his childhood sweetheart in 1948, and they raised 3 children in the new Germany that emerged from the ruins. He told his children stories about his time in America, but not the war stories other fathers shared. Instead, he talked about abundance and kindness, about a nation so strong that it could afford to be generous to its enemies. He taught them that real power was not the ability to destroy, but the capacity to build and share and lift others up. Years later, when Hans became a successful businessman helping to manage Germany's economic miracle, he would often think about that Thanksgiving dinner in Kansas. In his office overlooking the rebuilt city of Munich, surrounded by the prosperity that American aid and German hard work had created together, he would remember the taste of turkey and stuffing and the smile of the volunteer who had served him. He had learned in captivity that true strength was not cruelty or conquest, but having so much capability that you could choose kindness. America had not just defeated German armies, they had defeated the very idea that power must be cruel to be real. That lesson had shaped not just Hans's life, but the kind of country Germany would become in the decades after the war ended. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.